Hello, I'm David Tudor once more, and this is the third in a series of talks about conflict, security, stability, and development. This time we're going to look at the question of conflict and see what, if anything, we can say about the causes of conflict. Now, obviously, if we're going to talk about the causes of conflict, we need to know what we're talking about. And therefore, the first stop is obviously the recognized definition of conflict. Unfortunately, but perhaps not surprisingly, there isn't one. It's a curiosity of the modern world, although there are professors of conflict studies, departments of conflict, and thousands of books and periodicals devoted to the subject, there's no agreement about what it is. This is odd. There's also no agreement about whether conflict and armed conflict are the same thing. There have, of course, been many attempts to define conflict. Many of these attempts are numerically based and based on often quite fastidious legal definitions. And they're not very useful and often produce silly results, like, for example, there having been an armed conflict in the United States every year, more or less, since forever. Now, part of the problem arises from the fact that we've replaced war with conflict. We haven't actually replaced war, but we've replaced what we call it. We knew what war was because war was something that you declared and it was a legal state which had rules. Conflict, on the other hand, is much more amorphous, so it's not surprising that it's very hard to define, or at least it's hard to define in a way that everybody will accept. Now, this was a problem that the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia encountered in 1995. It had to decide whether it had jurisdiction in certain cases, and these cases required an armed conflict to be in process. So the judges went off, looked at the textbooks, and to their surprise discovered there was no definition of an armed conflict. So they made one up, and I'm going to put it on the screen now because I think it's the best attempt that's been made to date to define what an armed conflict is. Resort to armed forces between states or protracted armed violence between governmental authorities and organized armed groups or between such groups within a state. Now, there are obviously still certain definitional questions. What is protracted, for example? What does organized mean? And so on. But that's a lot clearer, and that is the definition that I'm going to use for the rest of this talk. Now, if we're going to consider the question of the causes of conflict, it might be useful to look at the attempts that have been made to explain the origins of particular armed conflicts. Take the First World War, for example, and we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the First World War at the moment. I don't know how many books have been written, thousands probably, about the origins of the First World War. I've read quite a large number of them. And there is effectively no consensus among historians, and there probably never will be. Now, if experts can spend decades and generations debating the causes of one conflict, then it seems a little presumptuous to suppose that we can ultimately find a single explanation for all conflicts, especially if we can't define what it is we're talking about in the first place. Now, I said there have been many attempts to find the causes of conflict, and these can be analysed in functional terms. What I mean by that is that causes of armed conflict are defined in terms of the interests of the organisation or the interests of the individual that is making that definition. So let me give you a few obvious examples. And most of them come under the heading of what we call cognitive bias. Cognitive bias is where you have a certain set of skills and experiences, and you apply those to every situation you meet. So, for example, economists naturally see the causes of conflict as economic, and they see conflict as being about the struggle for resources. Biologists will tell us that we are animals and therefore necessarily territorial. Realist international relations scholars, I think there are still one or two, see conflict as inherent in all political structures. Historians will say it's very complicated, and they're right. Sociologists will look for society-based explanations. Marxists will have their own particular view. Moralists will blame warlords or individual extremist politicians. Psychologists will talk about natural human aggression. And I've even come across human rights advocates who've argued that the basis for most conflicts is the denial of human rights. Now, one of the things that we can say is that some of these explanations contain useful hints for understanding some of the conflicts. For example, economists rightly draw attention to the problems caused by the introduction of liberal economic policies, and we can see that in the preparation for the conflict in the former Yugoslavia. We can also see it in the lead up to the conflict in Rwanda, for example. The problem is that most of these theories are very good at predicting the past. That is, they can be fitted to explain what has happened in the past. They're much less good at predicting the future. And in particular, they don't answer the question of why now. We can look back at certain conflicts. Currently, this is true of Syria. And we can say, well, that conflict was inevitable. But we can't say why it broke out in 2011 rather than 2009 or 2007 or whatever. Or we can try, but there will be dozens of different explanations as to why it was then and not earlier. And this really is the problem with many arguments about the causes of conflict, that they don't explain why conflict happened now. And something that sets a conflict off can be very different from the underlying causes of the conflict. Now, I said that these things serve a political purpose. And a particularly egregious example, a particularly silly example, is to be found in the Constitution of the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, where we read, to our astonishment, that war begins in the minds of men because of suspicion and mistrust among the peoples of the world. It beggars belief that anyone in 1945 seriously believed that was a cause of the Second World War, which they had just lived through. But it served two important political functions. One was to provide a rationale for UNESCO itself. Obviously, if suspicion and mistrust caused wars, then anything that reduced suspicion and mistrust must stop wars. So it gave UNESCO a job. The other, and perhaps more importantly, was that it got the responsibility for actually causing wars off the shoulders of those who actually caused them and onto the shoulders of ordinary people like you and me, or like our parents or grandparents, whose hatred and mistrust for each other apparently led to the Second World War, something which would be news, I think, to virtually every historian. But although that's an extreme case, we should remember that attempts to define the causes of conflict always serve a political purpose. And for that reason, I am somewhat doubtful about generalized attempts to explain conflict, as you've probably already gathered. Indeed, I'd go further and say that it's very doubtful whether there is such a thing, or could be such a thing, as a theory of conflict. There is arguably no such thing as conflict. There are only conflicts. If we had a universal theory of conflict, it should explain everything from the US invasion of Iraq in 2003 to post-electoral violence in Kenya in 2009. The fact that it manifestly can't, there could be no theory that would explain both of such events, which are not greatly separated in space or time, is an indication that it's a mug's game to look for single theories of conflict. It also encourages, I think this is the other problem, it also encourages the formulation of standard views about conflict. Once you think there is such a thing as conflict, and once you think you can define why it happens, you start to talk about conflict as if it were a thing, which it isn't. Let me just dispose briefly of a couple of misunderstandings about conflict as a single entity which have arisen in recent years. One is that there's been a progression from external or interstate conflict to internal or intra-state conflict since the end of the Cold War. This is manifestly untrue for two reasons. Firstly, most of the conflicts during the period of the Cold War were internal because they were related to colonialization, decolonialization, and the various civil wars that followed. Actual wars between states were relatively rare. Second, pure wars between states were even rarer, and indeed pure internal conflicts were very rare as well. Almost all wars, in fact, in human history have been an untidy mixture of internal and external conflicts. We are used to thinking of the Second World War as a war between nation states. In fact, it's been calculated that personnel, individuals from something like 20 different nations fought in sizable numbers on both sides. It was a European civil war as much as it was a war between states. And this pattern is actually fairly consistent right throughout history. So that's, if you like, the first problem. The second is the assumption that whereas casualties in war used to be at some indeterminate time in the past largely military, they're now largely civilian. Again, I'm sorry, this is unsupported by any evidence. The civilian population has always been the primary victim of war. In the 17th century, for example, during the 30 Years' War, it's estimated that a third of the population of Europe died. In some parts of Germany, that was as much as 50%. Even in the Second World War, the majority of deaths were civilian. Even in the First World War, on the Eastern Front, the majority of deaths were of civilians. It's also complicated by the legal distinction between civilians and non-combatants. These are not the same thing. I won't go more into that, except to say that these definitional problems are, in my view, a good reason for abandoning attempts to formulate general theories of conflict. In the second case, in particular, we have the associated problem of even deciding what death is. Now, you may think that's a rather bizarre statement to make, but general theories of conflict and of how conflicts evolve depend very much on what you think death is. In the case of the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example, where it is commonly said that 4 to 5 million people died from 1996 onwards, that figure is not uncertain because we may have lost 1 million bodies somewhere, but rather because what we're dealing with here are population-based demographic comparisons between before and after wars. What we're dealing with is not the number of people who were actually killed in the conflict, which seems to be quite small, but the number of people who died who would not otherwise have died. And this requires quite complicated statistical inquiry into things like death rates in different communes of the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo in the early 1990s. So many of these figures and many of these theories which are constructed on the basis of these figures are extremely dubious, and I suggest, frankly, that they should be left alone. I want to conclude, having been quite, if you like, negative so far, with two hypotheses which you might want to consider further. Both of them are relatively uncomfortable, but both of them, I think, have something to commend them. The first is that we need to distinguish between problems that have solutions and those that don't. If you prefer zero-sum problems, where my gains equal your losses, and vice versa, and zero-sum problems where there is at least some possibility that we will both gain. Now, the liberal assumptions on which a lot of writing about conflict these days is based, the liberal assumptions suggest that compromise is always possible, that conflicts start by mistake or because of wicked individuals, and that a group of people sitting around a table can usually arrive at a consensus and a compromise. Sometimes this is true, but when it isn't, the result is generally conflict, or at least the risk of conflict. A classic example is the Jewish-Palestinian problem. I can live in my house, or you can live in my house, but we can't both live in my house. And the stronger of us will take the house, which is essentially what has happened. As long as these disagreements exist, as long as there are non-zero-sum games, the possibility of conflict is always there. And indeed, if you look at history, and if you look at the current state of affairs, even in countries which are at peace and regions which are at peace, you see that institutions and countries are what Michel Foucault described as the result of peace as a continuation of war by other means. He was, of course, inverting Clausewitz's famous dictum. By saying peace was the continuation of war by other means, what Foucault was saying is that structures that we see, political structures, state structures, national structures, regional structures, frontiers, and so forth, are in almost every case the result of conflict and even violence of some kind, and that's undeniably true. Now, in a situation where there is a zero-sum problem, attempts to solve that problem by negotiation arguably can make it worse. Now, this is a terrible thing to say because people immediately accuse you of being a warmonger and wanting people to die. But I think it's objectively and empirically true in many cases. The second hypothesis I put forward to conclude is that maybe peace is just difficult. Maybe peace, I wouldn't say, is abnormal or even necessarily rare, but it's difficult to accomplish. Again, there is a liberal assumption that peace is normal and more or less inevitable, given a bit of good sense and cooperation on both sides. History suggests this isn't so, and that in order to arrive at a peaceful country and at a peaceful region, a whole series of quite complicated and difficult criteria have to be fulfilled. We've seen in recent years that the peace and stability in Europe, which we were, I think, justifiably proud of 25 years ago and congratulating ourselves on, is now threatened. And it may well be that we look back on the period between 1945 and 1989 as an exceptional period in world history, when in certain parts of the world only there was something resembling peace and stability. What is clear is that liberal economic policies left to themselves and uncontrolled, which they weren't in the generation that followed the Second World War, can actually destabilize countries very quickly. To go back to what I was saying earlier, this doesn't necessarily produce conflict, but it certainly makes it easier. Peace is a complex and difficult thing to acquire, and once you've got it, it's difficult to hang on to. Now, I'm emphatically not suggesting that the world is nothing more than a place of anarchic violence, and that we're in a Hobbesian nightmare of all against all. That would be, I think, quite unwarranted. What I'm suggesting is that what we need to look at is less the causes of conflict, but the causes of peace. And there, I don't mean the theoretical causes of peace. I don't mean the shopping list of things that ought to be done to ensure peace that you find in the manuals of international organizations. What I mean is why peace actually came to certain parts of the world, in certain places, at certain times, and what lessons we can learn from that. I think that might be quite an interesting exercise to carry out. Thank you.